A former counselor at Hazelden's adolescent treatment program in Plymouth is speaking out over what he considers a controversial policy, allowing young people who identify as a different sex to be placed on the unit of their identification without question. You'll hear in his own words why it hasn't gone well and why he believes it's time people realize what's happening behind these walls. We agreed to protect his identity for this interview.
I was energized by it. Like, I would come home and I was alive. You know, I had worked in the corporate world for 7 years prior and did well, was successful in terms of, like, I made good money and that was fine, but I never really felt like I was doing something that I loved. I never really felt passionate about it, and I never went to work really excited. And so once I got into this field and started working with young people, I was engaged. And I loved it.
This former Hazelden counselor asked we not use his name as he continues his work in the field where his heart is.
Getting a job at a place like that, like, you have clout in the industry immediately. And for good reason. Like, they've had a lot of success and they do a lot of really good work, right? Like, they have treated a lot of people and they have a system that works when applied appropriately, in my opinion.
So when does this whole issue even come on the radar for you?
As an intern, it was something that was going on while I was there, albeit it was typically like a one-off situation where you have somebody come in and they either are wrestling with what gender they identify with or they are unclear. I can think of multiple different instances where it's not all the same, but you have somebody who is identifies differently than their biology. And so, but in all of those cases, those clients are placed where they want to be, not based on their biology, but based on their identification.
And what did you think of that policy?
I don't think it's doing anybody a service, especially young people. If I knew my son was in treatment for 90 days and the individual sleeping next to him was a 15-year-old girl, I would not be happy. Yeah. And I would pull him out of treatment because I would argue like this is not going to help him.
He says it's a scenario he encountered 3 times in his 9 months as an employee helping to treat 14 to 25-year-olds for drug and alcohol addictions.
I have a perspective, and I understand that that's mine. I understand that my perspective is driven by my own experience, how I was raised, and so I don't want to assume that I'm right. I also want to understand, too, that, like, things are changing dramatically and at a really fast pace, and just kind of moving with the winds, if you will, is not always the best option as well. It's okay to slow down and understand, like, is this actually what's best? As a counselor, I have no say. We're not asked, really not given an option or an opportunity to talk about it either. I guess for me, it didn't really feel safe to talk about it. What I know from others is that it doesn't typically end super well. I believe that people struggle with their gender. I believe that people struggle with what they identify with. I believe that to be real. I also believe that just like every addict that comes to the table, everything that they're presenting to you isn't always true and accurate. I also think as well, when you're dealing with minors, it can't just be a black and white. There has to be a little bit more nuance to the discussion about placing men and women together. I also think that it's just the reality of what's going to happen is it's going to become messy and kids are going to fraternize with each other, and that's typically what happens. And then that becomes a distraction. And that's what I think is the biggest issue is clients are there to be treated for a disease that can kill them. And what happens is now they're distracted by something that is, and rightly so, really distracting. You have, in our case, you have a biological woman come onto the unit, and that's distracting to a lot of clients, and they'll voice that.
Perhaps what bothered him more was what he calls the secrecy behind it. Promotional materials on the website that point to gender-specific residential units and a video stating the same.
It's important for you to know that girls and guys are never going to live together or do any kind of treatment together. There's going to be 4 girls in each room, and with your room you get your own bed, your own wardrobe, a desk, and each area is separated by a privacy wall, so you can have your own space within a room with other people.
They're not necessarily lying, it's gender specific, but they're not being transparent about the fact that there will be instances where a biological female will live in a biological male unit, even if they're a minor. I think that needs to be known. I think that's information that's valuable to people who are paying for their kids to go there, and also, frankly, the people who are giving money to help fund treatment for people. If we're trying to promote a culture of honesty and transparency and responsibility, if we're going to do something like this, if we're going to place clients with each other like that, just be transparent. I would have way less of an issue if that were the case, right? I would probably not choose to work in that environment. But I would be way more respectful of an environment that is actually transparent about the fact that they're doing that.
In a statement to Alpha News, a Hazelden spokesperson said, "We appreciate and embrace the complexity of serving people with diverse gender identities. We do house people according to their gender identity unless they ask to discuss another option or there are other extenuating circumstances. We work to ensure everyone feels safe and comfortable. This is not an issue that has caused us significant problems."
You're working for the premier treatment center in the country, arguably in the world. Who am I to tell them what they're doing is wrong, right? It's just not my position, it's not my place. And there's also, nobody is pushing against this, right? And so when I've talked to people who I felt were safe and are, it's just met with, yeah, it's okay to kind of have those opinions, but that's not going to change.
Ultimately, the situation led this counselor to look for work elsewhere.
I would rather work in an environment where people can disagree because I think it makes people better. Again, this is a field of study where things are still changing and are really new. It's relatively a new field for just treatment in general. But then you throw in a lot of the changes with gender identification and identifying. That's also really new in terms of how we are treating that and how does that impact residential care. There's nothing that we're doing to really understand that. So just to make these quick decisions without understanding the impact that it could potentially have, not just on the clients that are forced to have to be around somebody who maybe who identifies as a male and isn't, but also that client, right? Like, we're not setting them up for success because this environment is not structured to cater to that, right? It's not designed for that right now because we haven't dealt with it. So it's doing a disservice to both parties, and that's where it's really hard is, everyone loses. It just doesn't go well when you mix them together. It doesn't. What I do know is my experience. It did more harm than good, and it created a lot of chaos, and it distracted people from getting care.